the desiertistegi of awakening. There comes a season in many lives when the familiar sources of meaning begin to fade. Things that once excited you no longer satisfy. Achievements feel hollow, relationships feel distant, and even spiritual practices can seem dry and unresponsive. This stage is often misunderstood, feared, or resisted, yet it is one of the most sacred transitions a human being can experience. What you are feeling is not the absence of life, but the withdrawal of illusion. The sense of emptiness is not punishment. It is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is the quiet signal that the soul is no longer nourished by appearances. The mind interprets this as loss, but the inner life recognizes it as preparation. When the outer world no longer feeds you, it is because you are being invited to discover a deeper source of life, one that does not depend on circumstances, outcomes, or emotional highs. This stage feels like a desert because the usual waters are gone. The strategies that once worked no longer bring relief, effort feels exhausting, answers feel distant, and yet, this dryness serves a purpose. It dissolves dependency on form, it loosens attachment to identity. It gently but firmly removes the belief that fulfillment can be found in things, people, or even ideas. In this desert, the ego struggles. It wants activity, reassurance, signs, and progress. It asks, what am I doing wrong? Or how do I get back to how things were? But awakening does not move backward. The former comforts were necessary for an earlier stage, but they cannot accompany you where you are being led now. What feels like loss is actually liberation in disguise. There is a profound humility that arises in this stage. One begins to see that striving does not produce peace. Control does not produce safety. Knowledge does not produce fulfillment. The desert teaches you to stop reaching outward and to rest inwardly, even when nothing seems to be happening. Especially when nothing seems to be happening. Silence becomes the teacher here. Not dramatic silence filled with visions or revelations, but ordinary, uneventful stillness. This is where the deeper work occurs. The soul learns to live without constant stimulation. It learns to trust without proof. It learns to be present without reward. In this space, something extraordinary is being formed, though it cannot yet be named. Many people abandon the journey at this point. They mistake emptiness for failure and return to distractions. They fill the silence with noise, activity, and spiritual entertainment. But those who remain, those who allow the emptiness to be what it is, discover something beyond feeling and thought. They discover a quiet assurance that does not come and go. A presence that does not need explanation. The desert stage is not meant to be conquered. It is meant to be surrendered to. The more you try to escape it, the longer it persists. The moment you stop demanding meaning and allow life to be as it is, the inner ground begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. What emerges on the other side of emptiness is not the return of old pleasures, but a new way of being. Life becomes simpler, deeper, and less dependent on external conditions. You no longer chase fulfillment because you are rooted in it. You no longer fear emptiness because you recognize it as a doorway, not a void. If life feels empty right now, do not rush to fill it. Let it be empty. Stay honest. Stay still. What is leaving you was never meant to sustain you forever. And what is coming cannot be rushed, only received. The desert is not the end of life. It is the end of false life. And beyond it lies a quiet fullness that does not announce itself, but once known is never lost. When emptiness appears in life, the immediate assumption is that something has failed. The mind concludes that joy has been lost, purpose has slipped away, or direction has vanished. Yet this interpretation arises from a misunderstanding of what emptiness truly signifies. Emptiness is not the collapse of life, but the gradual dissolving of supports that were never meant to carry the weight of your being. It is the undoing of false foundations so that something real can emerge. Throughout much of life, meaning is borrowed from externals. Identity is built on roles, success, recognition, relationships, beliefs, and even spiritual concepts. These structures give a sense of stability, but they are temporary by nature. When inner growth reaches a certain depth, these outer supports begin to loosen. What once felt solid starts to feel insufficient. This is not because they have failed, but because their purpose has been fulfilled. They carried you as far as they could. The experience of emptiness arises when the soul withdraws its energy from these borrowed meanings. The mind feels abandoned because it depended on them for reassurance and direction. But the deeper self is not empty at all. It is becoming free. The discomfort comes from standing between two worlds. The old sources of meaning have fallen away, and the new source has not yet been consciously recognized. This stage often brings confusion and restlessness. One may try to replace the old supports with new goals, new relationships, or new teachings, only to find that nothing satisfies. The reason is simple: emptiness cannot be filled with substitutes. It exists to expose the futility of seeking permanence in what is temporary. The more one resists this exposure, the more intense the sense of lack becomes. What is being removed in this process is not joy, love, or purpose, but dependency. The belief that life must be upheld by something outside oneself is gently dismantled. Emptiness feels threatening only to the ego, because the ego survives by clinging. When clinging is no longer possible, the ego interprets this as death, while the soul recognizes it as release. In allowing emptiness to remain without judgment or escape, a deeper stability begins to form. One that is not borrowed, not maintained, and not lost. What feels like nothing is actually the clearing away of everything that stood in the way of truth. The desert stage does not arrive to punish or deprive, but to reveal. When life enters this phase, outer comforts begin to fall away, not always in visible ways, but in how little they satisfy. Activities that once brought relief feel thin, and even success or spiritual effort seems unable to reach the deeper ache within. This stripping is intentional. It is designed to expose where dependence has quietly formed on things that cannot sustain the inner life. Comfort has a way of keeping attention outward. As long as something provides pleasure, reassurance, or identity, the deeper self remains unexplored. The desert removes these cushions so awareness can turn inward. What feels like barrenness is actually an uncluttered space where truth can finally be noticed. Nothing distracts, nothing reassures, nothing fills the silence, and in that absence, a more honest encounter with life becomes possible. In this stage, answers stop arriving through effort. Techniques lose their power. Prayers feel unanswered, not because they are unheard, but because the form of response has changed. The inner life is no longer being guided through rewards or emotional confirmation. Instead, it is being taught to stand without support, to trust without evidence, and to listen without expectation. This exposure often reveals how deeply comfort was mistaken for peace. Peace does not depend on stimulation, success, or certainty. Comfort does. When comfort is removed, the mind panics, interpreting the loss as danger, but the soul understands that what is being stripped away is not essential life, but the belief that life requires constant reinforcement. The desert stage invites a different posture toward existence. Not grasping, not fixing, not chasing insight, but remaining present in what feels unresolved. This presence allows hidden attachments to surface. One sees how much effort was spent trying to control outcomes, secure identity, or maintain a sense of being on the right path. As these efforts collapse, something quieter begins to take their place. The revelation of inner truth does not arrive as a dramatic insight. It emerges as a subtle shift in orientation, a growing ability to remain steady without explanation, a quiet confidence that does not depend on circumstances. The desert reveals truth not by adding anything new, but by removing everything that obscured it. When silence enters life, it is often interpreted as absence. The familiar inner dialogue loses its urgency, emotional responses feel muted, and the sense of guidance that once felt active becomes faint or distant. This silence can feel unsettling, as though something vital has withdrawn. Yet silence is not emptiness of life, it is life no longer announcing itself through noise. It marks a shift from stimulation to attunement. Dryness accompanies this silence in a very particular way. Inspiration fades, enthusiasm wanes, and practices that once felt alive seem mechanical or empty. The natural impulse is to revive the feeling, to search for methods that restore intensity. But this dryness is not a malfunction. It is a recalibration of perception. Awareness is being refined to recognize what exists beyond sensation and emotional confirmation. In earlier stages of growth, feeling is often mistaken for truth. When something feels uplifting or profound, it is assumed to be real and meaningful. When feeling disappears, doubt arises. The desert stage quietly corrects this misunderstanding. It teaches that what is real does not require sensation to validate it. Silence removes the dependency on emotional feedback so a deeper, steadier awareness can emerge. This stage also dismantles the belief that guidance must be dramatic or verbal. In silence, life communicates through stillness, through simple presence, through an unforced clarity that cannot be grasped or articulated. The mind may protest, wanting direction or reassurance, but the deeper intelligence operates without urgency. It unfolds naturally when resistance subsides. Dryness reveals patience. It shows how quickly the mind demands results and how uncomfortable it becomes when progress cannot be measured. Yet in this waiting, something essential is forming. Attention slows, expectation softens, listening deepens. The silence that once felt empty begins to feel spacious, not because something new has appeared, but because the pressure to experience something has dissolved. Silence and dryness are often mistaken for abandonment because the ego associates value with activity. When nothing seems to be happening, it assumes nothing is happening at all. But inner transformation rarely announces itself. It works quietly beneath awareness, reshaping perception and loosening old patterns of seeking. When silence is allowed to remain without resistance, it reveals a subtle companionship, a sense of being held without explanation, guidance without words, fullness without form. What first appeared as absence is recognized as a deeper presence, one that does not come and go, and therefore does not need to speak. The habit of seeking fulfillment outwardly is learned early and reinforced constantly. From childhood, Satisfaction is linked to achievement, approval, possession, and progress. Even spiritual seeking can quietly follow the same pattern, reaching for experiences, insights, or states that promise completion. This outward orientation feels natural, yet it ensures a cycle of temporary satisfaction followed by renewed lack. Each attainment fades, and the search resumes under a different name. Outward fulfillment depends on conditions. It requires circumstances to align, people to respond, outcomes to unfold in a certain way. Because conditions are unstable, fulfillment drawn from them must also be unstable. The mind tries to manage this by refining the search, believing the next success, relationship, or realization will finally settle the restlessness. What is not recognized is that the restlessness itself is generated by the act of seeking outside. The desert stage exposes this pattern by removing the reward. Effort continues, but the emotional payoff disappears. One may still achieve, still practice, still pursue understanding, yet nothing satisfies. This is not failure of effort but exposure of its limitation. Fulfillment cannot be reached by movement toward an object, because fulfillment is not an object. It is a state of being that cannot be acquired. As long as attention is directed outward, awareness is divided. Part of the self is always ahead, chasing what is not here. This creates subtle tension, a sense of incompleteness that no achievement can resolve. When seeking exhausts itself, a pause naturally arises. In that pause, awareness begins to settle back into itself, not by decision, but by necessity. This inward turn is not an act of withdrawal from life. It is a release from dependency on outcomes. Action may continue, relationships may remain, work may progress, but the inner demand for fulfillment from them weakens. Life is no longer asked to provide identity or worth. It is allowed to be what it is. Surrender marks the shift, not surrender to circumstances, but surrender of the belief that fulfillment lies elsewhere. In that yielding, something unexpectedly complete reveals itself, not as excitement or pleasure but as quiet sufficiency. The seeking that once drove life falls away, and with it, the sense of lack that seeking was trying to cure. The ego is constructed from identity, preference, control, and continuity. It exists by defining itself through roles, beliefs, memories, and expectations. Everything it values depends on contrast and possession. Because of this, emptiness appears to the ego as a direct threat. Where there is nothing to grasp, nothing to define, and nothing to compare, the ego finds no ground on which to stand. When life enters a stage of emptiness, the ego reacts with fear and resistance. It searches for explanations, labels, and strategies to restore familiar structure. It may interpret the experience as depression, failure, confusion, or loss of direction. These interpretations are attempts to reclaim certainty. The ego cannot tolerate not knowing, because not knowing dissolves its authority. Emptiness exposes the fragility of identity. Without stimulation, validation, or narrative, the sense of who I am begins to loosen. This feels like disintegration, but what is dissolving is not the true self, only the constructed image that required constant reinforcement. The ego survives through attachment. It clings to meaning, control, and future resolution. Emptiness offers none of these, and so the ego experiences it as annihilation. This resistance often intensifies the discomfort. The more the ego tries to escape emptiness, the more painful it becomes. Activity increases, seeking becomes frantic, and explanations multiply. Yet none of these efforts succeed, because emptiness is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition in which the ego's strategies are rendered ineffective. What the ego fears most is not suffering but irrelevance. In emptiness there is no role to perform, no achievement to pursue, no image to maintain. The ego has nothing to do, and in doing nothing it begins to fade. This fading feels like death because the ego equates existence with activity and identity. Yet what remains when the ego loosens is not nothingness. Awareness continues clear and unburdened. Presence remains without effort. Life goes on without the constant commentary of and mine. The ego cannot survive in emptiness because emptiness does not oppose it. It simply does not support it. When emptiness is allowed rather than resisted, the ego gradually releases its grip. What emerges is not a new identity, but freedom from the need for one. The space that once felt threatening becomes a refuge, and the silence that once felt deadly reveals itself as life unconditioned by fear. Striving is rooted in the belief that fulfillment is somewhere ahead, waiting to be reached through effort, improvement, or refinement. This belief shapes much of human activity, including spiritual pursuit. One strives to become better, clearer, more awakened, more whole. Yet striving quietly reinforces the assumption that something essential is missing now. As long as this assumption remains, fulfillment is postponed into the future. True fulfillment does not arise from accumulation. It is not the result of perfect practice, correct understanding, or sustained effort. These may refine the mind and discipline attention, but they cannot produce what is already present. Striving keeps awareness oriented toward becoming, while fulfillment exists only in being. This is why effort eventually exhausts itself in the desert stage. It reaches a point where pushing forward no longer works. Surrender enters not as a technique, but as a collapse of effort. It happens when the mind recognizes the futility of control. The endless attempt to manage experience, correct feeling, and secure outcomes gives way to a simple allowance of what is. This allowance is not passive resignation, it is an active release of resistance. In surrender, nothing is demanded of life, and nothing is withheld from it. When striving ceases, attention settles. It no longer leaps toward resolution or retreats from discomfort. It remains present even in uncertainty. This presence reveals that fulfillment was never absent, only obscured by effort. The constant reaching created noise. Surrender creates space. In that space, a quiet completeness becomes apparent, not as emotion but as stability. This fulfillment does not fluctuate with circumstances. It does not intensify through success or diminish through loss. It is not excitement or pleasure, but a sense of being at home in one's own being. Because it does not depend on outcomes, it cannot be threatened by them. Life continues with its changes, but the inner ground remains steady. Surrender also dissolves the idea of a personal achiever. There is action, but no one claiming ownership of it. There is understanding, but no identity formed around it. Fulfillment flows naturally from this absence of grasping. It is not earned, it is uncovered. What effort could never deliver reveals itself effortlessly. Not because something new has been gained, but because the struggle to become something else is ended. The journey through emptiness, silence, and the desert stage is not a detour from life, but a return to what is real. What appears as loss is the falling away of borrowed meaning, false supports, and outward dependence. Each stage removes what cannot endure so that what is enduring may be recognized. The discomfort is not a sign of failure, but evidence that inner growth has reached a depth where illusion can no longer satisfy. The desert teaches without instruction. It reveals that fulfillment cannot be found through striving, sensation, or identity. It shows that silence is not absence, and emptiness is not negation, but the ground where truth becomes visible. The ego resists this stage because it cannot survive without control and definition, yet its loosening is not destruction, it is release. When resistance ends, something steady remains. Not excitement, not certainty, not answers, but a quiet sufficiency that does not depend on conditions. Life continues, but it is no longer carried by effort or fear. Meaning arises naturally, not from what is added, but from what has been surrendered. The desert is not meant to be escaped or explained. It is meant to be lived through with honesty and stillness. In allowing life to strip away what is temporary, one discovers what cannot be taken. What began as emptiness reveals itself as fullness without form, and what felt like an ending is recognized as the beginning of a life rooted in truth rather than search.